let's talk about the MCAT. That's why y'all are mostly here. My name is Rebekah Rogers. I graduated from Spelman, class of 2014. Upon graduating from Spelman, I went directly to medical school. I was in the Charles Drew Medical Education Program at UCLA. I was in medical school from 2014 to 2019. I'm giving you a little background on my MCAT history. I scored a 33 on my first time taking the old MCAT. I took it in 2013. And so based on the 2015 update, when they changed the scoring system, the new scoring estimate would be about a 516 based on the same percentile. So I scored in the 92nd percentile on the old MCAT. I decided I didn't want to be a doctor while I was in medical school. I went through first year, went through second year, had some challenges, personal and academic, and went into third year and really recognized I didn't actually desire to be a physician with my life. I knew I wanted to impact medicine. I knew I wanted to have some kind of contribution to diversifying the field of medicine and increasing the quality of life, specifically for the underrepresented and those who have a lot of adverse challenges because of their life experiences. However, I recognize that my specific passion and my specific talents were more suited towards me teaching students how to prepare for medical school, how to become physicians, specifically by teaching the MCAT. And so my intention when I left medical school was to pursue public health. However, I left medical school December 2019. And for those of you who have not really been conscious for the past 3 years, we had a whole public health pandemic. And so that really also changed my perspective on what public health meant and how I could impact the world in terms of increasing quality of life for everyone who's alive right now. So that's why I shifted. I created the Black Roots. I am doing that full time, and that's really what I found a lot more beneficial for my life. I can talk a little bit more about like my actual medical school experiences after the session is over if you do have any questions about that, but that's just a little bit of background about me to give you also understanding of why I teach the MCAT, how I got here. I've been teaching the MCAT since 2013. I used to teach for one of the major test prep companies. However, I didn't really like the way they were doing things, specifically because I felt that the one size fits all approach didn't really help with the students that I was really passionate about helping. So I branched out and do it on my own now. Before that, I also taught the SAT and ACT. So I'm very familiar with the structure of standardized tests. However, I do think that MCAT is somewhat different than other standardized tests. And we'll talk a little bit more about why I believe that as we go through the session. So overall, the MCAT is set up to 4 sections. The first section being the Chem Phys. Most students call it the Chem Phys just to shorten up this really long name, but I really want to emphasize that this says Chemical and Physical Foundations of Biological Systems. So the Chem Phys section in and of itself is not just chemistry and physics. There's a AAMC PDF that I will be walking us through as soon as we go through the overview to discuss what it actually means to be in the content of each of these sections. But for now, I really want to emphasize it's of biological systems. So biology is also going to be tested even in the Chem Phys section. It's not just in the biochem section. The Chem Phys section, you have 95 minutes to get through 59 questions. Those questions are broken up into freestanding questions as well as passage-based questions. Freestanding questions are sometimes called discrete questions. Those are questions that are not attached to any kind of passage. They require some kind of outside information and or calculation or critical thinking and just eliminating things that are not the correct answer to get you to the correct answer. Whereas passage-based questions are somewhat self-explanatory. They're based on a passage. You will be given a passage, have some type of data you may have to analyze and answer questions appropriately. As far as pacing and timing, I don't believe there is a one-size-fits-all for anything when it comes to the MCAT. So I don't emphasize pacing and timing and let you know how much time you should be spending on each question, things like that. Those conversations I really believe are more when students are hitting about 508 or 509 consistently and trying to get into the above 70th percentile into the really, really high scores. So for most students just trying to break 500, get that, I need this score to be able to clear the screening process for some medical schools or to just get where I feel I'm competitive. Pacing and timing is not going to be the biggest issue if you know how to approach the section based on your strengths. And that's far more what I'm going to be emphasizing throughout this session when talking about strategies. After the Chem Phys section, you get a 10-minute break. I will also advise during that break, you have to sign out, which means you have to fingerprint or they have to pat you down and a lot of other things, and then sign back in before. When you exit, you have to sign out. And then when you go back into your test, you have to sign back in. And that is all budgeted into your break. If it takes you more time to sign back in, the test will just be going. So that 10-minute break is really more of like a 7-minute break, giving yourself time to get in and out of the test itself. After that break, you have the CARS section. It's called Critical Analysis and Reasoning Skills. This is the one section of the MCAT where there are no discrete questions. All of the questions are based on a passage. These passages do not have any type of data for you to analyze in the normal way you are used to seeing data presented in terms of charts and graphs and numbers. It is presented to you in the form of words. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the CARS section and how I encourage students to think about the CARS section, because a lot of students are often coming from a standardized test perspective. They think this is like the English section of a standardized exam, but this is very different than what an English section would be testing. So we'll talk more about the strategies in a little bit. The CARS section, because it has no discrete questions, you still have 95 minutes. However, there's only 53 questions, not the 59 like there are for the other 3 sections of the exam. Once you finish the CARS exam, you get about a 30-minute break. Again, you have to check back in and out. So that 30 minutes is about 25 minutes. This is where you are assumed to take lunch or dinner, depending on what time you're taking the MCAT. Some MCAT dates have 8:30 and a 2:30 or 3 o'clock. I don't know exactly what time. Start time. And so if you're starting at 2:30, 3 o'clock, that 30-minute break is going to be dinner. If you're starting at 8, that's going to be your lunchtime. So you have to provide your own lunch, bring your own foods. I also encourage you during the breaks to make sure you're hydrating, make sure your stomach is not empty and your brain is able to actually function and not be thinking about keeping yourself alive. It's able to actually do the work that is required of the MCAT. After that 30-minute food break, you have to go and do the bio and biochem section. This is where students tend to feel the most confident. We're going to go through how the score breakdown happens for the MCAT. It's somewhat confusing, and so I'm just going to explain it a little bit further. But this section is one of the sections that students tend to perform the best in. Just transparently, when I took the MCAT, this is the section I did the best in. I was a biology major in college, so it didn't really surprise me that this is the best section that I had on my test. That being said, this is bio and biochemical foundations of living systems. So it's not just the human body. You also have to know a lot about microbiology. So parasites, viruses, bacteria is a lot more common on the biochem section of the MCAT than it previously was. When it comes to understanding other viruses, bacteria, et cetera, you also have to know like how they do transcription, how they do translation, what the differences are, because a lot of that is how we treat diseases when it comes to infections. And that was a lot of my medical school experience. So just, I will let you know, like, it's not for nothing that they're testing these things. That's also why I really enjoy I wouldn't say I enjoy the MCAT. I understand why the MCAT is structured the way it is and why they're testing the things they are testing based on having gone to medical school and also having been involved in a lot of the like restructuring of medical education, just learning a lot of that. I understand why they're testing the things they're testing. So living systems have to know more than just the human body. However, the human body is the major focus because you're going to be treating humans, not bacteria. This is, again, same as the Chem Phys section, 95 minutes, 59 questions, passage-based and discrete questions, which means there's some questions based on the passage, some questions that are not based on a passage where you do have to have outside information. I will also let you know that for some of the questions that are passage-based, they are still quote unquote freestanding in that you don't have to actually have the passage to answer the questions. So one thing I strongly emphasize for students that I work with when doing like strategy on these passage-based questions is try to answer the question before you look at the passage. The passage is there to distract you, not really to help you. And so you are the one who has the knowledge. You are the person who's going to be the physician. At the end of the day, these passages, you can think of them like patients. Patients have Dr. Google and they think they're going to come in and Dr. Google is going to be exactly what's going on. And sometimes it is. Like sometimes you can go to the passage and be like, oh yeah, no, that's exactly the answer. I found it. However, there are sometimes you go to Dr. Google and they're like, doctor, I have stage 3 thyroid cancer. And you're like, your thyroid was removed 10 years ago. This makes no sense. So you have to actually use your own logic, not just what information you're given to be able to answer the questions. And that's what the MCAT is really testing, is how confident you are in what you know. And do you know what you know, and how logical is what you know? I know that made very little sense, but we'll talk more as we go through. After the biochem, again, you have another 10-minute break, shortened because of the check-in, check-out process. And then the last section you have is the psych-soc section, which is psychological, social, biological foundations of behavior. So again, emphasizing biologicals creeping into the psych-soc section. It's not just in the biochem section. So there will be some biological concepts, specifically as it comes to like neurology and like vision and memory and such, that are going to be tested in the psych-soc section. That tends to jar students because they think it's far more of the I don't even know any psychology. I really try to not remember scientists' names predominantly because most of them, I don't want to go into that detour, but a lot of scientists, I don't feel a need to remember anybody in life, to be honest with you. And so I don't know who the psychologists were, there was somebody, but a lot of what the psych-soc section students think is testing is like those types of concepts. So like Maslow's hierarchy, et cetera. But it's also testing neurology and your understanding of how the brain works and how the brain is structured. Similar to the other quote unquote science sections, this is a social science or science, and so it is still science considered. This is 95 minutes with 59 questions that are discrete and passage-based questions. Does anyone have any questions about how the overall MCAT is structured, broken down, just the flow of the MCAT? Okay, and so all of those sections evens out or adds up to a total of 7.5 hours for your total exam. That is recognizing you don't have to take that 7.5 hours, because you don't have to take those breaks if you don't want to. You could power through all 4 sections and it's less time than that. And you can also not spend all 95 minutes of each section, and then it would also be less than that. However, if you do all of these things with the time you are allotted, the test is 7.5 hours. And that is daunting in and of itself, because for the most of you, this is the longest test you have taken up to this point in your life. So that is not lost on me. It is a daunting exam. So the MCAT is broken down into a curve, or it's scored on a curve. And what a lot of students think the curve is the curve is it's based on a lot of previous data of students who took the test before. So this current curve, this is going to be the curve that if you're taking the test before April 30th, 2023 of this year, this is how you will be scored according to the curve. What that means in terms of the raw score may be different depending on the test. They don't give you the raw score, which means like the actual absolute number of questions you're getting correct. But in comparison to other people, this is how the curve is going to be set for the students taking the test in the spring, winter and spring. The biggest thing I want to emphasize about this is that the mean or the average is a 501.6. When the MCAT was created with this new scale, they wanted a 500 to be 50th percentile. That was kind of the intent of how this test was struck, like how these scores were set up. So 500 is 50th even, except students are doing better, quote unquote, in some sections. And so this mean is shifted. And so you can see overall, if y'all know basic statistics, I don't even know if this is considered basic, but whatever. If you know any kind of statistics, this curve is somewhat shifted to the left or to the right, where the mean is over where the middle number is. And the standard deviation is really wide too. So 10.8 means to like 512, you're still within one standard deviation of the mean, which means you're not above the 67th percent or the 84th percentile. So 512, if you go here on this part of the graph or on this part of the table, you'll see 512 is 83rd percentile. So a lot of the intention of the MCAT for it to be standardized, quote unquote, is around standard deviations and statistical analysis to make sure that they're like reflecting the students overall. So you see there's a much longer tail down here in the lower numbers than there is in the really high numbers. Far more students are getting in the lower numbers than students getting in the really, really high numbers. And that's somewhat challenging for the MCAT. A 520 to a 528 is all the 100th percentile. Same thing, 472 to 475 is all the less than first percentile. But you see, it takes up until a 485, 486 for you to break out of the 10th percentile, whereas the 90th percentile is at a 515. So it's not as balanced as they would like this to be. And that's something that they're working on. So a lot of the questions that you may be getting that seem kind of confusing or like you haven't seen before are because the MCAT is trying to test out how to make sure this stays standardized and doesn't over time become really skewed to the right, where it's not reflective of anything other than access and privilege and the amount of time you had to prepare for the test. They want this to really be, if we're trying to get students to become doctors faster, earlier, but also when they are the most prepared, you want this test to be as reflective of students of all ages who are prepared to become physicians. So I will drop this link to the to this graph as well as the overall what's on the MCAT PDF, which is 111 pages. But we're going to talk a little bit about it. I'll drop those links into the chat when the session is over as well. Does anyone have questions about how this overall curve works? Yes. So then, oh, yeah, go ahead.
My question is not really when it's pertaining to the graph, but due to the changes within the MCAT, is this resulted within the changes within MCAT requirements for a lot of medical students? I mean, for a lot of medical schools now? Is that why a lot of them have pushed their MCAT requirements like to 500 or like slightly above 500 now, due to it being like the middle range?
I cannot tell you the logic of why medical schools are doing what they're doing. The research behind the MCAT, which is the reason this thing is so validated and why I don't think it's like the SAT or the LSAT or any other standardized exam for any other school you're trying to go to. There's a lot of research. The MCAT was created by the AAMC, which is also the body that accredits medical schools. So they know what you need to be a doctor, and they're making the test to assess that. Their research is showing that a 495, the reason that these tests also kind of matter so much, and I'll talk about it a little bit on the next slide, so I'll just talk about it now, is because you're going to be taking a lot of exams to become an actual physician. There are a lot of licensing and board exams that you're going to have to take. in order to be a physician. And so the MCAT is also assessing, are you ready to take those exams? Because medical schools only have a short period of time to make sure that you are qualified to pass those exams. And there's just a lot of stuff on the line for that. And so the research that the AAMC has done has showed that a 495 is reflective of a student being able to pass more than a student being 50% or more likely to pass a standard at their board exams. Step 1, step 2, step 3, and whatever other licensing exams you take. Specifically step 1, because that's the test that you have to take during medical school. So a 495 is what the AAMC will consistently say is the cutoff score to be able to say a student, to be able to confidently say a student will pass step 1, which is why this matters so very much. Medical schools are also going for this like ranking system. They're trying to get funding and so many other things. And so their numbers may or may not be informed by the research that is done by the AAMC of why the MCAT exists. There are many medical schools that recognize and understand 495 is what we really need to be focusing on. And so that's their targets, but some schools care about ranking and funding and other things. And so their numbers are skewed because of that, not because of this being more reflective of a different score still showing you are ready to take step 1. Does that answer your question?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much.
No problem. Do y'all have any other questions? So the MCAT, it is required to attend most med schools. That's just, it is what it is. The AAMC does what it does. So yeah, it's not, medical schools are not having the same level of conversation about removing the MCAT requirement that law schools and other graduate programs are for their standardized exams. The MCAT's still pretty required for most medical schools. I say most because there are always caveats to things. Most schools still require the MCAT. This is a test assessing whether or not you will pass your medical training exam. So I talked about that a little bit before. The MCAT is created by the AAMC because that's really what matters the most, is you being able to successfully get through medical school, where there's not a lot of remediation required, where there's not a lot of other tests and things. And so it is absolutely necessary to make sure you have that foundation before you start medical school. They don't have time, and it's just not, med school's not the time to be building that foundation. There's so many other things that you need to be learning in that time. So giving yourself the time to make sure your foundation is set is so valuable when you are preparing for the MCAT. And so it is testing that. I'm also going to say it's long and it is hard. I'm not going to pretend like it's not. If y'all have seen that commercial, you know what I'm talking about. But yes, it's not the most simplistic, straightforward exam. It is meant to be challenging. You are not trying to be, you're trying to be a physician. Like, you want to be someone who has a terminal doctorate degree that requires a higher level of effort, thought process, learning, knowledge, so many things than if you were trying to just get an associate's degree or something that you had to get in the prior training to become ready to be a doctor. So yes, this is hard. But with the MCAT, it's not impossible. Yeah, it's hard. It's not impossible. There are a lot of things that are going to be challenging that you have to address and assess as you prepare, but it is not impossible. It's also not only for the privileged. Yes, it is predominantly a reflection of how privileged students are. I won't say that's only what it is. I have had many experiences with students and classmates, and I know physicians who did not come from a privileged background, but were very successful on the MCAT and in other aspects of their life, both in career and other things they do in life. So I'm not going to say it's only for the privileged. I acknowledge, yeah, a lot of times there are so many, the MCAT has also acknowledge that it in and of itself is not discriminatory. It's a reflection of the discrimination that exists in the education system in America. So yeah, it's kind of a culmination of all of the other disadvantages that students have had in their lives may just lead to the MCAT being this summit that they feel is impossible. But I really want to emphasize it's not just that. There are definitely things and challenges you're going to have to overcome. If you don't have that background that other people have, or that the MCAT assumes you need to have in order to be successful on the test, but it's not going to count you out before you even start. It's also not an IQ test. It's not a reflection of how smart you are at all. It's a specific test with specific things that you have to learn about in order to be able to be successful. It's not a reflection of how smart you are. And it's not a memory game. A lot of students think that the more things that I memorize, the better I will be. And there are a lot of programs that will emphasize the more you memorize, the better you'll be. The MCAT is not about memory. One, we've got Google. Like, as physicians, medical schools and medicine understand, like, I'm looking this up if I don't understand it. If I don't remember it, like, I'm Googling it. I'm not about to like risk a patient's life or their health or their quality of life because of my memory. Like, I'm looking it up. We have progressed as a society. Yes, before, physicians absolutely had to memorize a whole lot of things. Completely understand that. We're not there anymore. So the MCAT's not testing memory in the way that it used to be testing what memory was. It's testing if you understand the rationale behind how these equations happened in the first place. If you know how these equations got developed in the first place, you don't have to memorize the equations because they're not actually testing the equation in and of itself. So I really want to emphasize it's not about memory. And it's not a reflection of your ability or capacity to become a physician. There are so many students who think, okay, well, I failed the MCAT one time, or I failed this one practice exam, so then I guess I'm not going to be a physician. I guess this is a sign that I shouldn't be a physician, that I'm not capable of being a physician. My first MCAT practice test, I got in like the 14th percentile. And I had to have a very strong conversation with myself of like who I had to become, what I was going to have to do, what I was going to have to sacrifice if I wanted the outcome that I wanted, that I knew I was capable of getting. But I was looking at myself as like, this version of you today, right now, she's not. So we got to fix some stuff. So who you are currently is not, this is not your MCAT process is not a reflection of your capacity to be a physician. Your actual MCAT score is not a reflection of your capacity. There are many physicians who will tell you, I barely passed the MCAT. I didn't get a great score. Now they're doing amazing things. It's not a reflection of you being able to be a physician, which goes back to the only being for the privilege. It's not only for the privilege, but those things kind of go together. Right? Understanding that and acknowledging that, but then acknowledging that that doesn't have to be what defines you really will make the difference when it comes to you preparing for the MCAT. If you have any questions about just the overview, what the MCAT is and is not, the sections themselves. So then I want to break down the sections a little bit more in detail. The ChemPhys section, 59 questions in 95 minutes, like I said previously. Those questions are passage-based and freestanding or discrete. So some will be with a passage, some will not be with a passage. This ChemPhys section is covering 2 foundational concepts. After we go through the entire slideshow, I'm going to pull up the foundational concepts and just briefly go through what those foundational concepts are. It's really long, and 5 out of 10 of the foundational concepts are psych-soc concepts anyways. So not anyways, because the psych-soc section matters as well. But so much of the concepts are broken into psych-soc that I don't want to spend a lot of time going through the foundational concepts. I also want to emphasize the foundational concepts are not everything being equal. There are some things that are far higher yield than other things, but the MCAT has just an exhaustive list of everything that could be tested on an MCAT for you to be able to say, yeah, I know everything. I'm ready to be a doctor, even though, like, if you ask most doctors, they don't know everything of the foundational concepts. Just, you know, life. The concepts themselves, when we go through it, it's describing a narrative. It's not describing, do you know this? 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 It's, do you understand how life and development through physical concepts is applied to biological systems? Things like that is more what they're making sure you have an understanding of. And that's really why I emphasize this isn't about a memorization. It's about like, how did we get here? So the narrative of how this is even a concept Science is not an absolute. All of the things that you know and learned, somebody discovered. They established this as a concept, but the MCAT's really testing if you recognize that, like, that's not absolute. Nothing's absolute. So even the equations that you have, the MCAT's going to test if you understand the like exceptions to every single rule. So knowing the narrative helps so much more than having to be like this and this and this and this and this and this and this, and having to think you're memorizing a lot of things. It's also less overwhelming. It becomes more engaging, and because it's more of a story, at least for, in my experience working with students I've worked with, that tends to be more of like their cultural experiences is learning through stories, learning through oral narratives, as opposed to learning through structure and explicit memorization. There is math on this section of the test. Again, the math is not about memorizing stuff. The math is honestly testing if you know if you're going to like give the patient the right dose, or if you're going to like over prescribe or under prescribe for a patient. So they're testing if you know scientific conversions. A lot of the answer choices, this is a multiple choice exam. So it's not like you actually have to go and do math. You don't get a calculator. So there's that. The numbers on the MCAT, they're not going to be crazy numbers for you to be out here like, I need a calculator, I need a calculator, I need a calculator. If you take a deep breath and recognize, okay, 10 to the third versus 10 to the first means it's times 1,000 or 100. And so there's a bunch of other things. I have to move these decimals. The answer choices may be like 100 milligrams, 100 picograms, 100 grams. And so it had nothing to do with you getting the number 100 and everything to do with you doing the right conversions and knowing all of the metric prefixes and things like that. So again, when we go through the actual PDF, we'll talk about what specific math they're talking about, but recognizing it's far more of conversions and scientific notation than actual calculations of things. There is kind of calculus on the MCAT. They say it's not actually tested. It's not necessary anymore for you to take calculus to go to some medical schools. However, there are some concepts, especially within like Newtonian systems and like acceleration and velocity and position, that it helps to understand calculus just because of like areas and things like that. But it's not necessary to know calculus. So again, about the physics formulas, it's not about memorization. It's far more about knowing how these formulas got created in the first place and when these formulas can be applied, when these formulas cannot be applied, and why these formulas cannot be applied in certain situations. There's also some chemistry formulas. Before I talk about self-identity, there's also some chemistry formulas, especially with like stoichiometry and like molar conversions, where you have to recognize like solids or precipitates and things like that within a system. Those things are absolutely things that you have to be able to understand how and why. The MCAT's not going to give it to you that this is a solid. You have to be able to predict what's going to be a solid within a system, what's going to create an aqueous solution, why it's going to be able to dissolve based on hydrogen bonding, et cetera, et cetera. So they're going really deep with you having a full integrated knowledge and understanding of things when they're testing. As we started this session with a meditation, I really emphasized the need for you to set your mind right before starting any process of this type of challenge, because who you think you are is who you are, and what you think you're capable of is what you're capable of. And if you go into the chem phys section like, well, I already know I'm really bad at math, I already know I don't know anything about physics, and I already know that this is going to be my worst section, that's going to be the outcome. I'll be transparent. When I took the MCAT, I definitely knew chem phys was about to be my L. Like organic chemistry was the worst grade on my transcript by far. And it was a struggle for me to even get the grades that I got. So I knew chem phys was about to just be whatever. It is what it is. I'll do what it does, whatever. And when I got my actual score on the chem phys section, I was really disappointed. I still did very well, just to be clear, but I was disappointed with myself because like literally right after taking the section, I knew there were 2 questions that I was like, I counted myself out. I could have gotten that right, and I just gave up because I didn't feel I knew what I was doing and I couldn't push myself through. And that was the first section of the test. So I had to have a strong talking to with myself of, you got to get it together. There are a whole lot more sections, a whole lot more questions, and you can't be thinking this about yourself every time. You're going to waste a whole lot of questions. And there's only 59 questions in this entire section. Every question matters. You can't be giving up little things because your mind's not in the right place. So your self-identity, what you think you are capable of when going through these passages, is really, really important. And when you are adjusting your strategy, it has to come from your understanding of your self-identity. So I knew when I took the chem phys section, I knew optics was just L, like that. I don't know. When I teach optics now, I know-ish what I'm doing, but I'm still like, I have to look at I have to watch a video and relearn it every single time. It just does not stick in my brain. So that was one topic that when I took the MCAT, I was like, I already know if I see an optics passage, I attempted to study it. And every time I studied it, I was like, this is not interesting. This doesn't make no sense. I'm bored. This is just, it's not happening. And I recognized that the optics was not a significant portion of this section of the test. So I didn't actually need to understand everything. So that became part of my strategy. Was I know as soon as I see an optics passage, I just start thinking bad about myself. I start knowing that I can't do this and I'm not actually ready to be a doctor. What if I have a patient who has an eye disease and I can't die? And I was like, bro, it's not that serious. So I had to decide optics passages was something I was just guessing and moving on, wasn't even thinking about. There were too many other things that actually mattered that I knew I could do well on, that I was not spending my time or my attention focusing on. And so for all of you, I encourage the same thing when you're developing your strategy. Think about the things, the topics as you study. What are the topics that you're like, I'm not engaging? No matter how many times I go through this, I'm just not engaging. If you recognize this is like half of the test, like you can't say I am not engaging in biology. That's a significant portion of the test, and you won't necessarily do well on the MCAT if you just take an L on all of those topics. But if there are little things that you know is just like, I ain't got this, and when you go through practice tests or even practice questions and section banks, and you see, oh, this isn't even that like commonly tested, you can decide that becomes one of the L's you take. And once you decide there's one passage that you're guessing on, that frees up more time for you to attempt other questions. You do not have to actually get every single question correct or attempt every single question on the MCAT to do well. You have to get a certain number of questions correct based on what you do well. When you are going to be a physician, like when I got to med school and we started learning about like ophthalmology, it was bad. And I could tell, like, I kept telling myself, like, you already knew this was going to be bad. Like, you already knew it wasn't going to go well. The beautiful thing about medical school is they're teaching you to be all kinds of doctors. And so no one thing matters that much. So I could get by not knowing ophthalmology, but knowing enough other things that I was still passing tests. You don't have to be like excellent in all areas to be a great physician. You have to decide where you want to specialize and just go hard and do that well. So know what you're not, and it's really helpful to like know what you're not going to do well, because then you're not wasting time. You're able to really focus your attention and time on only what you want to do. So that's just a word about how to develop your strategy based on your self-identity. I don't think you should be developing a strategy based on certain pacing or timing or techniques. I think that it's really based on who you think you are and allowing this test to optimize who you know you are in the time you are given. There are certain things that you know that you also have to accept. I'm just not going to have time to understand all of this. That's not what I'm here to do. I'm here to answer some questions. So adapting to doing that is really important when developing your own strategy. So then next is the CAR section, critical analysis and reasoning skills. This is not an English exam. This is not reading comprehension. You'll notice there's nothing that says comprehension at all. This is analysis, reasoning. This isn't asking you to comprehend anything. They intentionally make passages that are not comprehensible because they're not asking you to comprehend. And that's something that I think students often just don't recognize when they're taking the CAR section. They read a passage and they're like, okay, so what did I just read? And it's like you read paragraph 3 from page 19, and then you read paragraph 7 from page 45, then you read paragraph 2 from page 6. And that means nothing at all. It means nothing, but that's the MCAT. They're not asking you to make this make sense. They're not asking you to comprehend what just happened. They're asking you to answer some questions based on what you just see. And the same thing when you are dealing with patients. You're not there to like become their friend. You are there to treat them for something that they're coming to you with. And so when I do my strategies when I'm teaching students for the CAR section, I make a patient interview analogy, where you think of this like doing a patient interview, where you recognize like the patient might come in and start talking about stuff that happened 2 weeks ago. They might start talking about something that happened when they were 9 years old. They might start talking about their like son, and then they might like go off into La La Land and talk about a vacation that they're planning next in 14 years. And you have to somehow synthesize all of that into, but you're here to talk about diabetes. And so you have to make all of that into, okay, diabetes. Well, we can talk about if they're going on a vacation in the future, we can plan for the foods that they would be eating. And then we can like segue into talking about foods they're eating now. Maybe they like cooking for their son. I don't know. But you have to figure out how to make this a fluid interview based on what the patient is giving you. And they're not always going to be giving you greatness. There are some CARS passages that you'll get and you'll be like, oh my goodness, this makes sense. And you're just like, wait, what am I doing? I must be doing something wrong. There's no way a CARS passage can make sense. But there are some pages that you'll come in and be like, no, like I get it. I feel like a doctor right now. Like I know what just happened and I treated them and they are happy and they're healthy. So like, cool. And there's some patients you're gonna be like, bro, I have no idea. I guess we're referring this out because I could not tell you what just happened here. That's what the CAR section is really about, is like, are you ready for the ebbs and flows of the patient experience? So there are no freestanding questions in the CAR section. It's all passage-based. There's 9 passages. Like the other sections, you don't have to do all 9 passages. I encourage you to not do all 9 passages unless you're trying to get above the 90th percentile in the CARS section itself. Even that being said, we're going to talk a little bit about the CARS curve specifically. And the CARS is the students for this upcoming year. The CARS section has the lowest overall curve of all of the MCAT sections. So even that being said, with that being said, I don't know if you need to do 9 passages to even get in the 90th percentile. I don't know what the raw score is, so that's always up in the air. But I do know that you don't need to do all 9 passages if you were trying to get a 500. You need to answer questions as you are able and not waste time doing stuff that you know makes no sense anyways. You can just refer that out and move on with your life. CAR section, the questions themselves, you only get points on the MCAT for answering questions correctly. So the focus on all of the passages, especially on the CARS passages, is answering the questions, not understanding what you just read, if you're reading at all. But there's 3 question types. There's foundations of the passage, which is asking you questions about like the main idea, the tone of the author. Those are predominantly the things that come up within the foundations of the passage. That's like the overall passage. But then there's also things that are more specific details of the passage, and they'll ask you questions about that. Those can be split up into reasoning within the text, where it's like, okay, was the author trying to say, what was the author trying to say? Like, what were they inferring here? What do they mean by this? But it can also be reasoning beyond the text, where they give you like new information and they're like, so if the author found out this, what would happen? And you have to be able to answer that. And those are the types of questions that tend to be more challenging for students because that's way more like the critical analysis aspect of it. You have to figure out, okay, based on the author's tone, based on what the author was pointing out, would they go with this? Would they not go with this? Why would they go with this? And so I really emphasize for students to work with the answer choices, figure out what's different amongst the answer choices, and from there, answer the question, like eliminate incorrect answers to get yourself closer. And if you still have no answer that you think is correct, just guess and move on. None of the answer choices are going to be very satisfying for you either. A lot of times when you're treating patients, you're going to be like, okay, so I'm going to give you these drugs that you need to take. These are the foods that you need to be eating. I need you to go exercise this often. I would like for you to see a therapist, like all of these things, and you will be healthy. And then the patient comes back the next month and is like, I did one of those for 3 days. And you're like, bro, what? Like, it's never going to be what you want it to be, or very rarely going to be what you want it to be. But you gotta work with what you got. Like, well, at least you didn't X. At least you didn't X. Those things are eliminated. So this is the best answer, I guess, we've got. And adjusting your mind to be able to work with things and not try to make up something that's just never going to be there, or like fit a square peg into a round hole. If there's one word about the answer that makes the answer incorrect, the whole answer is incorrect. There's no like, well, I'm just going to ignore this word and then this is the correct answer. Like that's, the MCAT's literally testing if you have the ability to like not ignore things. Like you have to focus on the little details, which is why the critical analysis part comes in to that part, to those questions. There are different passage topics. The MCAT likes to be diverse, and so they used to break it down into like 4 different basic types. They don't even really break it down into basic types anymore. There are just different topics. Most of them are going to be they're all going to be non-scientific. I believe that's still in effect. There's been a back and forth about like, this is not a science passage. I can't be doing science passages in a non-science passage. So I believe none of the passages will be science related for the CAR section. It will be more social sciences. So like philosophy or like literature, fiction, but it could also be like historical passages is more of the topics that are going to be tested. So if you know, and on each passage,
I just realized this date is not analogous with what.
So on each of these topics, they have, or on each of the passages, they'll have like a copyright information, which is basically they have to like say when the thing was published, what the title of the article is, what the title of the book is, et cetera, et cetera. And so you can read those things. It's at the very end of the passage and decide, okay, this topic sounds interesting, this topic doesn't sound interesting, to help you decide if this is a passage for me to attempt or not, and take more control over the passage. I will advise you to do the MCAT in your own order, to do the CAR section in your own order and not do it in the order given to you, because a lot of the times it's structured to be challenging in the order, if you do it in the order it is received. If you do it in your own order, it will make you feel more in control of the exam and less stressed out if you get a really hard passage, knowing you can just skip it and move on and come back to it if you have time later. Same thing for all of the sections. Recognizing your self-identity and applying that to how you're developing your own strategies is going to be very important when doing the CARS passage. So knowing if this is a topic you like to do or not do, knowing these are questions that you're just at a 50-50 and you're wasting way too much time just guessing and moving on, really knowing what you think you're capable of, framing your mindset to be in the right space before you start the test, and assessing your mindset throughout the exam to make sure you're staying in that good space. Okay, so this is the curve for the CAR section for up until April 30th, 2023. So you can see in comparison to the overall curve, which was shifted somewhat to the right, the CARS curve is shifted somewhat to the left, where the mean is below a 125, which is what would be the actual middle score. The mean's below that. And so the overall curve is shifted to the left, where students are far fewer getting these high scores. And it's much more common for students to be getting below between a 123 and a 127, 123, 126. So the CARS curve specifically in comparison to other curves, students will not be graded as harshly or scored as harshly for this section compared to other sections. So you can see the 124 is the 48th percentile, but to get above the 90th percentile, you only need a 128, as opposed to for other sections to get into the 90th percentile, for like the Chem Phys even needing a 129 to be in the 90th percentile. For the bio or psych-soc section to be in the 90th percentile, you need a whole 130. So the CARS section is the one section where the scores overall will be, what score you get on the CARS section may be lower because the overall curve is lower. And so your percentile may be higher with a lower score. Okay, so after the CARS section, you have a biochem section, another 59.95, passage-based and discrete or freestanding questions. Passage-based, again, eliminate some of the passage-based questions may be freestanding. So figuring out if you need the passage before actually going through the passage to answer the questions is going to be very helpful in just using your time appropriately, using as much of your own process of elimination before using the passage to answer the questions. There's 3 foundational concepts in the biochem section. Again, we'll briefly go through the foundational concepts after we go through the slideshow. But again, the biochem concepts are, again, more of like a narrative, not memorizing a bunch of content. This does still test some physics or chemistry because of the whole the biochem aspect of this. There are going to be some calculations you still may need to do. So there still may be some math that you are doing within this section as well. But it is predominantly biology, general biology, microbiology, some general chemistry, some physics, and then biochemistry and anatomy and physiology. So as always, your self-identity, deciding what passages you're going to do, making sure you're in the right mindset, making sure you're able to stay focused and not get skewed by thinking thoughts of I can't, I won't, I shouldn't be here in the first place, etc. Allowing yourself to be fully engaged and optimize your strengths. And then the last section is the psych-soc section. Psych-soc section is another quote unquote science section. So you got 5095, you got passage-based and freestanding. The psych-soc section, the freestanding questions tend to be very much so memorization. So this is the one section, or not memorization, but like just which of these is or is not, which is this, what did he think? Da, 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 da. And so really being able to do, this is the one section where I encourage students to do flashcards in addition to flashcards for amino acids, but that's another topic for another day. This is one section where overall I encourage students to do flashcards consistently in order to help them retain the information, because so much of what they're learning isn't as much of like narratives being able to be created. It really is just, what did Maslow think? What stage is from 2 to 5 in whoever had stages, all of that kind of stuff. So allowing yourself to know there are some things that you're going to have to just memorize. There are some things within med school you are going to have to just memorize as well. But for the majority of it, it's really more about like analyzing and reasoning your way through, recognizing you have Google for certain things. But some things it's just like, you're not going to want to Google this every single time. So eventually you're gonna memorize it. Like the amount of times I've Googled the coagulation cascade is ridiculous. But if you ask anyone who's been to medical school at least in the last 15 years, they've probably Googled the coagulation cascade enough times to be like, I'm committing this thing to memory. So there are some things that it's just helpful to have memorized because of the amount of times it's necessary, even if it's really complicated to understand. Like I said earlier, this has 5 foundational concepts. These foundational concepts is an exhaustive list. So everything is not going to be high yield just because it's on the foundational concept, but they want to make sure that they did not leave anything off. So students have some resource to be able to say, I know all of these things at least, and so I'm ready to take the MCAT. And so there are 5 foundational concepts for the psychosocial section. And this is where it's testing very specific concepts as well as overall generalized ideas. I talked a little bit about memorizing, and this is like the one section where I think it's helpful. This is the section, there's a lot of research that has been done about how to structure standardized exam. And when you take the MCAT, you will recognize that they don't ask about your demographic information until after you take the test, because research shows that, going back to the whole idea about self-identity, the researchers showed that if you ask a student like what their ethnicity or race and or gender or name, if you ask any of that identifying information before they start the exam, they will tend to internalize the stereotypes that go with that and then perform according to those stereotypes instead of perform according to how they had prepared. So the psych-soc section is the last section of the test, and I don't want to not acknowledge how much more of a impact, like personal impact, the psych-soc section would have on a person who cares about equity in medicine, who cares about diversification of medicine, or who cares about treating patients who come from diversified backgrounds that have been historically treated negatively by American medicine, to be specific. And so the MCAT and like medicine wants physicians who know, who have an awareness of like the history of how we got here and how like patients are and why they are the way they are, but they also don't want that to impact student performance excessively. And so that's why psych-soc is the last section of the test. That's why I think psych-soc, so I'm almost positive psych-soc is the last section of the test. And so for more than any of the other other sections of the test, I really encourage you to be aware of your self-thoughts, your self-identity when you are going through this test, and recognizing just because you're talking about stereotype threat doesn't mean you're currently experiencing stereotype threat. Just because you're talking about racism in medicine doesn't mean that that's going to define you or has defined you. And I really encourage you to stay focused on those, on the test itself, and just control your thoughts, which is a lot of like the mindfulness and et cetera, which is like, it doesn't come easy. It comes with practice. And that's why I really encourage meditation and mindfulness practices throughout life. But allowing yourself to just stay focused on the task and not get so distracted by all of the other thoughts and emotions that can come with some of the things that may be tested on the psych-soc section. And that also goes back into the whole privilege aspect, because if you don't have those personal experiences, you're not going to have to fight through that when going through the section. You can just take the test. So I recognize it is a completely different thing for somebody who comes from a diversified background or who wants to treat patients who come from diversified backgrounds to take the exam than other people. And I don't want to underestimate or not acknowledge the value and beauty of students like that, but also the added challenge that it may be to get through the MCAT, because that's how you identify. Are there any questions overall about the exam, what's tested, what's not tested, how it's laid out? I don't recommend any of that. I have not found that there's a magic amount of time to study for the exam. I have found that there is a person a student has to become to be ready for the exam. And I do not know how long that time will take. And so I do not like to say this is the time period that you need to study. Some students are juggling multiple different things. When you go to medical school, most schools don't allow you to have a full-time job. And so the things that you're juggling while you're studying for the MCAT aren't things you're going to be juggling while you're actually in medical school. That being said, if that is something that is a challenge that you're having to like go through while you're still in the pre-med process, like you have to pay your bills to be able to get to medical school, it's going to take you longer. But there does come a time where you have to build in time to I strongly believe there needs to be at least a 2-week period where you only do the MCAT. You don't talk to friends, you don't go party, you really don't hang out with family that much. Like, you are isolated and just studying and preparing for the MCAT for at least 8.5 to 9 hours every day. That is what I have found for students, is when they are very prepared to take the MCAT, because then they're all of the length of the MCAT is no longer a challenge for students. The amount of information that they're going to be tested within a day is no longer a challenge. The amount of just like focus and sacrifice to be able to focus for that long is no longer a challenge, but it takes time to build that. This is not a sprint, it's a marathon. I make an analogy of that a lot with my classes, of you having to be ready to run a marathon, which doesn't happen overnight. Some students can train some people can train for a marathon in a week. Some people need years to train for a marathon. I don't know how long that time will take. It really depends on each student independently. I will say the courses that I offer it's 12 weeks total is a course that I offer, because that is what fits into students' schedule the best. Just honestly, like, I don't think 3 months is the golden period of time. I studied for 12 weeks, and I don't think I could have studied a day longer than 12 weeks. I was ready to be done, but I know that's the type of student that I was, and that's why I signed up for the course that I signed up for, because I knew I needed to have that fire under me to keep me accountable, to make sure I was getting stuff done, because I only had a certain period of time and I wasn't extending that time. I think there are some students who, if they just say, I'm gonna study for the MCAT, but they don't give themselves a time period, or they don't give themselves like a deadline, they'll just procrastinate. They won't really do anything every day. They won't accomplish the to-do list that they had wanted to, but they also go into it with, well, there was never really a timeline for completion anyways, so I'm not really behind. If you recognize you're that type of student, I would encourage you to put yourself on some kind of timeline. Like, no, you can't fall behind. Like, you have to actually hold yourself accountable, because there is a deadline. And that is something that no one else can give you. When I talk about the person you have to become, it's that internal accountability is one of those things. When you're in medical school, people aren't holding you accountable to getting all of your studying done. You have to know when you're not going to be able to sleep tonight because you have a lot of stuff that you need to get through. You have to know when you're not hanging out with your friends because you need to do your studying. That's on you. That's on nobody else. You have to be personally accountable, but everyone's timeline for that is different. And I don't think it's helpful to tell somebody how long they have to become who they want to be. So I don't think it's necessary to put a timeline on it. If you start studying and you recognize there are more things that you didn't think you were going to have to study, but now that you're deep in the process, you know you need more time, and it's to your benefit to give yourself more time, extend your timeline. I also offer a self-study program that's like 12 months off rip, or on a monthly basis if you just need to do a little bit of studying. But I know that allowing yourself just to have access to that for a longer period of time helps students give themselves the ability to sufficiently go through everything. In short, I don't think there's this magic time period. I think there is a person that you need to become, and what that time period takes is what that time period takes. I think it depends on where you are in the process. If you are still taking prerequisites, I don't think it's helpful for you to study everything. I think it's beneficial for you to just go through the topics that are on the MCAT that you're going through in your classes at the moment, and just seeing how those things can be applied to the MCAT. So like the QBank. UWorld has a QBank. I think some other people have a QBank as well. But having some type of just question bank where you can see what types of questions based on the subject type, I think that's very helpful if you're still in the prerequisite space. I think if you're actually preparing for the MCAT and you're like in deep into it, the days are going to be different depending on what you need to get done. Some days you may recognize, okay, I actually would be more beneficial for me to just spend the entire day focusing on learning information. Some days you may recognize it's more beneficial for me to spread out all of the things that I'm learning and really just prepare myself for the breadth of information that I'm going to be tested. So if you recognize, like, I don't know amino acids, you can do that in multiple different ways, depending on how you're feeling during the space. I don't think that there's a one size fits all for that studying process. I give like a suggested schedule in the course that I offer. I give a suggested schedule because it's based on how like I'm going through specific topics when we have lectures, and there's certain things that are just the focus for each week that there's a specific schedule. But if you are doing an independent study or you're doing your own structured schedule, I think it's far more important for you to give yourself time to go through the topics you need to in depth. But also, if you know this topic, I really am just in a rabbit hole here. I don't really need to be going into this much depth with it, forcing yourself to move on and do something else and not just get comfortable because you feel confident.
When studying for MCAT, do you think that it's better to actually do one of the pre-planned programs if you're like one of those students that like need a set strict schedule?
If you're a student who needs a strict schedule, do you think it's best to purchase one of the programs? Is that your question?
Yes.
I don't, best is a difficult word. I think like students' financial statuses are very different. And so I recognize how expensive a lot of those classes are. And so I can't really say, yes, you have to do that if like literally financially you can't afford it. I don't think it's necessary for you to have those if that's the type of student. I know for myself, that was something I knew I needed. And so I started studying for the MCAT in June. And so like the August before that, I told my parents that this is what I wanted to do. And this is what I wanted. Like I was trying to take this class and this is how much I think it's going to cost. And so I just worked with my parents for that entire year to like, they paid for half and I paid for half. So I had like the whole year to save up for half of the class. So I don't think like I'm not disillusioned to how much those things cost. And I know that it was something that I knew there was not another option for me. Like I was just going to be way too distracted if I didn't have a course like that. And so it was worth the investment for me, but I can't say it's necessary for every student because financially I know every student can't necessarily afford it. Thank you everyone for attending. And I hope to see you in future sessions as well.